she'd be like, okay, who's your roommate, Claire? No, see, like the thing is, if I do put like my, if I do put my dress in front of the door, like, you know, the fire door would like go off. Dude, actually, yeah, no, it's like, it would be like bad luck for me if I actually did that and then the fire. Yeah, I just couldn't read it on that. I know, I feel like
Thank God.
Let's check it out.
You'll be on the camera.
Oh, yeah.
Sick. Is it see on that screen now?
Screen hole. Oh, when you talk, it follows you. That's right. Ah. Leave me alone. Come on.
Gideon was doing some research paper. He said over like the voice.
I did the same one, dude.
He said, I don't get the voice. I was like, who won last year?
No, it's not gonna happen.
Yeah.
Dude, I literally only said it to you. That was my.
You literally facing them, you're like,
No, I didn't. I went like this. That's literally what I said. And then I turned around. And then I was really.
Raleigh, bro.
Bro, so far away. I could come back there. Like right back. Well, that's pretty far though. You guys,
Yeah,
are pretty far back. You guys are pretty far back though.
I mean, you can sit at that table.
Maybe next time.
Yeah.
Then Kate won't do this spot.
I would appreciate that. Oh, I kind of like.
Anybody have a motion?
Yeah.
What's going on there?
You have a motion? Come on, for a motion, please.
Oh, I put the Quizlet in the study.
Oh yeah, I saw something about, well, I didn't look into it. Did I show you, the one with Harvey sent me? That's the one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I added the Quizlet to that one.
I need to, share that with a bunch of other people.
Yeah, I shared it with Heath earlier.
Dude, look at that.
What?
Kaden, how do you feel like you must care?
I really don't like it.
On, turn around real quick, turn around real quick. No, like the other way. Good, not too much. Look at them. You got a jawline.
Hold up.
He's like, I don't have a passport.
It's not on my mask. This is a jawline.
It's like zooming out.
Every time I talk, it like just focuses.
Nobody has a motion?
He's gonna go stretch for those shoes.
2020 spring.
That was easy.
2020 fall.
Yikes.
I mean, I was like, I
Every
don't know
time
what
someone
else
will
to
be
tell
like, all
you.
right, after this, we'll go do our essay.
You're a good friend. I was. John was like, I know she's flirting. Thank you. Get over here.
That's what I actually want.
It was.
There you go.
Thank you.
I hid it.
I'm not doing it. I didn't want to do it. I was just like, yeah. I'm out of it.
I feel like lightheaded
I
today.
cut my fingernails and all the skin that was.
Advanced tumbling.
I was sorry. I'm glad I'm doing
Two tests. I got two tests here. Like two tests this week. The next week I got an inductive study, a report, and a test, and then a test.
That's a lot. I know this.
I just have, the prison
Who
epistle
cares?
intensive thing. That's this coming weekend.
Are you skipping that?
I wish.
When's Broward?
The net October 9th, 10th, 11th. I was gonna go to that, but
Yeah.
I have
Oh,
another
okay.
intensive weekend.
Yeah.
Saturday.
Yeah, okay, I've seen that.
He doesn't look that good one.
He said,
Then you know he's playing, man. Come on. I don't think he's seriously.
yeah, I don't even.
Yeah, like I thought this was already established.
Take it easy.
Take it easy.
Rob's like, what's easy?
Okay, we're about just a few seconds before the bell, and if some of the others will log in, that's fine. As you know, next time that we're together, we'll take our test, so come prepared to take your test with the use of your computer, unless you send me a message otherwise, letting me know you'll need a paper test, so that I'm prepared for the number that I need. Otherwise, so Dallas and anyone else who's, if they're not here in class, will just take it in the same way that you would have.
Well, hopefully I should be out by then.
Well, yeah, we all hope.
I miss you, Dallas.
But if not,
too.
like you did with the Zoom classes last year, you'll need your camera on and take the test at the same time we do. So as for your attendance. So keep that in mind. And so let's begin. Father, we do thank you that you're working here. We pray that you'll be with us on this special day. Give us your strength. Help us as we learn together about history and preparing for your grace in our lives. We know that you are involved in the history of the world. We pray that you'll help us see yourself, and then that you will make us productive citizens in the world in which we live. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so next time, test. The material that I'm going to be covering today, both the slides and whatever we go over today, is not going to be on the test Wednesday, but will be later on in the semester. So when we cover Greece and Rome. So this material here will be the foundations of world culture. Kennedy, if you don't mind turning on your video feed while you're here. So, the beginning here is with the Minoans, which are the beginning of Greek civilization. This culture was centered on the island of Crete and off the coast, off the mainland. And it is interesting that what we might think of as one of the early foundational cultures of Greece would be from an island. But they had the first ships that were suitable for long voyages and created ruins there that are still significant to see. Knossos, which is on the north end of the island, is of the city. Here's a artistic drawing of it when it was finished. You can go there today. It's part of the national park system for Greece. And they have restored it to some degree. Now, they wouldn't do that today, as I may have shown when I show my pictures from the Holy Land and other places. Some ancient archaeological sites from the 1800s, when archaeology was really in its infancy, they did more what they might saw as reconstruction to try and put the things back together. And but today that would not be done because there would be fear that they would be misrepresenting it. They're not really sure what the actual place is. The Palace of Minos is what we see here. It was equipped with running water, sanitation systems, not what we would think of as air conditioning, but venting ducts that were designed to allow fresh air to filter down into the interiors of the building. And then that were properly cycled so that the stale air that is hotter would rise to the top and leave the building, whereas the cool air would flow down into the building and bring in fresh air that would allow the interior sections of the building not to be cool, but to be livable. And that's key technology, to be able to have a system like that. It is thought that this palace is where the legend of the Minotaur came from, which was a bull-headed creature that would eat a damsel that was selected for the purpose of being sacrificed to the gods. Now, what is thought is that this mosaic was found in the palace, which might indicate that they played some sort of ritualistic games or circus, what we might think of activities in which people might have jumped over a bull. As you can see, one is like straddling its back, another is grabbing onto its horns, and there's a person back here that seems to be trying to catch someone. So I don't know exactly what happened there, but there could have been some kind of activity along that line that if you didn't do this properly, the bull might have gored you, and in doing so, that's sort of like getting eaten by a bull. I'm not sure. But of course, the theory was that there was sort of like a labyrinth, and a person would be required to go through it. And if they were able to make it all the way out, then they were safe. If not, the Minotaur would eat them if you happen to run into him somewhere along the way. There could have been something similar to that, where people were going through a maze and there was a bull in there and you had to figure out how to get by it if you happened to run into it, as a way of entertainment or something. I'm not sure. But there is the ancient legend from the mainland that you would send a person over there to Crete, and this is in order to ensure good crops and all the other things that such things usually did. They also seem to have worshipped an early version of what we would think of as the mother goddess, form of something like Athea or Demetria or Aphrodite, that will make its way into both Greek and Roman mythology later on. Now, looking at this map, you can see this is Knossos on the island of Crete here. But most of Greek civilization from here on out, now, of course, there was definitely shipping and being able to travel by sea, because there were Greek settlements in what we think of as Ionia, Ephesus and Miletus maybe being the most important, Troy, and then in Greece proper, Delphi, Thebes, Athens, Corinth, Menacee, which is probably the earliest one, and Sparta. And then up in Macedonia, we have Pella. Of course, Mount Olympus is a great worship area. Just so that this may have confused you, it always confuses me, geographic confusion. This is Ionia. This is the Ionian Sea. You would think this would be Ionia, but it's not. Or that this would be the Ionian Sea, but it's not. I don't know how these two things got their name, but they're not really associated with each other. This is the Aegean Sea here, with the, which is the main body of water that both sections of Greece are surrounded by. Now, Greece and Turkey do dispute this land even to this day. All of the islands in the Aegean Sea are part of Greece, no matter how close they are over here. That's another dispute. Turkey wants half of them. And that goes back to this ancient claim that all of this area here in the Aegean Sea should really be part of Greek society. Now, about 2000 BC, the first Indo-European Greek tribes called the Achaeans entered Greece. They formed citadels here in Menacee, Pella, and Athens. And the great wealth of the Menaceian kings was seen in the by the findings of Heinrich Schliemann in 1876. Now, he's the same man who discovered Troy. He will also excavate here at Knossos, and does a lot of the early excavations on the mainland of Greece. There are two major languages for this group. What we call Linear A, which was their most commonly used language, we've never been able to read it. No Rosetta Stone here. But Linear B, which was a minor language, gave insight into daily life after it was discovered that this language was ancient Greek using a different form of spelling, different alphabet and system. So instead of it being characters representing sounds, it was characters representing syllables. And once the correlation was made as to what sounds represented what, it was a significant linguistic discovery that this was actually, once you knew how to translate it into Greek characters, it could be spelled. But anyway, beginning then, this civilization will remain powerful for many centuries. But beginning at about 400, from 1100 BC to 750 BC, we enter into what we now call the Greek Dark Ages. It was 400 years of drastic depopulation decentralized and non-bureaucratic government. Commerce was local, and art became simple. Architecture and writing was also simplified. And Greece, during this period, is not a very sophisticated society. It is only after they come out of this, in the late part of this period, from 750 BC on, Greece will try and rebuild itself, starting with Athens. Now, we begin by looking at the basic of their civil structure. Every Greek city was basically its own independent commonwealth. They called these polises, P-O-L-I-S, polis in Greek meaning city. And this was the basic political unit. Each city had its own legislature, its own king, its own religious and to some degree political system. From this, we derive the word politics that we still use in English today to deal with the political operation of a government. A high fortified city or section of the city would be set aside as a refuge from attack, but also the most important buildings would be put up there, usually the temples to the local gods. When I was on my trip to Israel, we stopped in Greece, so we were up there on the Acropolis. This is a painting, but this theater is still there. It's still usable. They'll still have plays there, and it's from the ancient time, right at the foot of the Acropolis. And this shows you that building platforms on top of mountains to extend their usability, like was done by Herod in Israel, in Jerusalem, was not uncommon. In fact, was normal in the ancient world. I've been up there, walked up those steps by these various ruins, and then the most famous one is the Parthenon. The reason why it's in such bad shape is because in the 1200s or thereabout, this area was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And there was war between the Ottoman Empire and the country, the city-state of Venice, who wanted to extend their trading areas into this region. They controlled several islands in the Aegean Sea. Venice did. It was an independent country now, then at that time. And the Parthenon then was not seen as sacred anymore. They're Muslims, so they don't regard the idea of it being a temple to Diana or Athena or some Greek god important. They were using it to store munitions, like a powder magazine. And during the campaign, the Venetians sent one of their crazy little rockets that were highly they weren't really something that you could guide. You just kind of shot it in the general direction of what you were trying to hit. And one just happened to hit the Parthenon and blew up the dynamite or gunpowder or whatever was inside. And that's why this area is completely blown away and the roof was blown off. But since it's made of columns, most of the explosion force just went out through the columns. And I'm told that before that it was in pretty good shape. Now, the decoration, the sculptures that were on it that survived that attack are now at the British Museum in London, where they were taken in the 1800s when it was worked on, restored at one point. Now, so this Acropolis, though, is definitely worth seeing. The Greek government does want them back. The British don't seem to be in any mood to return them. Now, a traveling center in the city would be called the Agora. And this is down in this area. This would have been where Paul would have preached. and would have met the different, would have seen the tomb to the, or the temple to the unknown God and the like. And so that is also open for tours. Now this city-state, as we see in Greece, nobles took over the government, making an oligarchy. Greeks planted colonies throughout the Mediterranean world from 750 to 550 BC, sending Greek culture not just in this in the local area in Greece, Turkey, and the islands, but also to what now we think of as Spain, North Africa, even into the Black Sea, up to Crimea, and most famously to Greece. I mean, not to Greece, but to the Italian islands and mainland. And some of the best preserved Greek civilization buildings are actually in what we would think of as Italy today, from this time period. The economic progress and use of coin money created a middle class, and that's good, because having money, free-flowing capital that you can spend that is really worth something is good for your economy. You could imagine if we didn't have money that we could spend, that wealth accumulation would be far more difficult. In many societies, you had to acquire commodities or land or raw materials and then use those as bartering chips in order to be wealthy. And a middle class, merchant class, is far more achievable if you're able to acquire, if you have money that you recognize. Now, a tyrant. We use the word tyrant today to mean someone who is a mean or unscrupulous leader. But actually, when the term was initially used here in Greece, and we get it from them, but was one who usurps power, a person who takes power who doesn't have the legitimate right to it. So today, people may call the president a tyrant, but he has, and they may be thinking that he got power by cheating in the election or something, I'm not sure. But that's what it would normally be used. Seize power, but usually the tyrants in the ancient world were actually supported by the underclass. The desperately poor and rising merchant class often supported a tyrant seizing power because they were more likely to be nice to them than the people who were invested in the power structure that appointed them. They did not necessarily have the present connotation of brutality or unfairness. Here is a map of just how far the extension of the Greek society would extend to Cyprus, North Africa, Italy, Spain, France, and around the Black Sea. Significant colonization. But if we're going to see the two societies that are really important here, we're going to go back to the mainland and look at Athens and Sparta, because it is the conflict between these two city-states that will take up most of the ancient Greek history. Now, Sparta, it was a militarized society, and it was on the lower section, which is called the Peloponnesus, and controlled this area of Greece. It dominated the Peloponnesus, they had contempt for anyone who expressed pain and hardship, and they enjoyed inflicting suffering on people to prove if they were worthy to be a true Spartan. The military ran the country, or at least the military interests. State officials would examine all infants, both male and female. Now, female infants Their only value was to grow up, be big and strong, and produce lots of other infants later on. But in both cases, male and female, they would be inspected to see whether or not they were healthy, vigorous children. And anyone who didn't fall into that category would be left to die of exposure in the woods because they weren't worth the time of the state. If you weren't a good person, a person that would achieve state ends. For boys, they would be placed in state schools that were boarding schools at age 7 for the purpose of being trained for military service. You see, those that they thought wouldn't make it were already euthanized. I suppose that anyone who might not make it at this point might also be, they might not be a soldier, but they would have to be support staff, something. At 20 years old, they were put in the army and lived in barracks. At 30 years old, they were allowed to marry. But their only purpose, the only purpose for marrying would be to sneak home at night on occasion and see their wife. And that was for one purpose only, to ensure that she was producing more little offspring. And you see, she doesn't have to care for these kids after they get to be age 7 when the state takes them. So it's not as though this is a big hardship for her. At least they wouldn't think. The people running the show didn't think so. When a military officer would achieve the age of 60 or so, he would be discharged and allowed to go home and live with his family. His only purpose was to fight in the war and to be, and so the idea that, you know, mothers might do things to, like, you know, intentionally do things to, we would think, injure their sons, you know, put bones into their skin and get them to toughen up so that they could be inflicted with injury and just go on. You would do that because you would be a better mother if you could produce better soldiers who could fight and not be worried about pain. So your goal would be to not to allow for anyone to be weak, because weak people didn't survive in this society. Now, putting that aside, let's recognize this. The Spartans were significant soldiers. When my wife was when we first got married, she was at Fort Sill, and the unit that she was in, they were the Spartans. Even to this day, the idea of the Spartan and the mystique of that says that you are good soldiers. Later on, we will see how once Greece and Sparta kind of merged together, how the Spartans are really like the stormtroopers. I mean, you send them out to fight because they really, you can almost use this phrase, they were bred for the purpose. Even if they quit euthanizing the weak, if you do that for a couple hundred years, you're going to breed out of your society a lot of things that by just allowing certain ones to grow up and be productive members of your society. Now, Athens, on the other hand, although they were certainly a militaristic society, they were not, their goals in life were not just to be a powerful army. And what we think of as Greek civilization and modern European liberal civilization, that comes from Greece. They started out by having what we think of as a council of nobles. And this became the supreme ruling authority in Athens. Archons, 9 magistrates, would eventually replace the king. And they had a beginning of what we think of as democracy. In 594 BC, Solon was made a sole archon, the sort of like we would think of as president. With authority to revise the Constitution. Common people granted important political rights. Laws needed ratified by a popular assembly, similar to a legislature, but almost sort of like a town meeting, that still go on in many New England towns. If anyone's from New England or know people there, town meetings are still important to have a once a year meeting of all the citizens of a town. I have a feeling that today that might be more difficult to accomplish than it once was. Reforms did not completely satisfy anybody. The rich weren't happy, nor were the poor. I'm not surprised. In 560 BC, Pisistratus seized power as a tyrant to try and rectify the situation. Later on, power was seized again to resist Spartan interference in Athenian affairs after Pisistratus died, and set up a new council, which is first what we think of as the first regular legislature, called the Council of 500. Can anyone guess how many people were on this council?
500.
500, you're right. It's 500. There is one cautious and brave person in the back.
This one test.
Well, the Council of 500 is a term, but you wouldn't be asked how many people were on it. But what is important about it? It is the first, administrative organization. It was required that this would supervise the actions of the archons, the leaders, the 9 administrators, or up to 9 administrators that would be over the country. It was the most democratic government in the ancient world. It may not have been fully democratic, but it clearly was the most democratic government in the ancient world. Now, Persia. Now, Persia will conquer what we think of today as Asia Minor, Thracia, and try and move into Macedonia. This is the Persians of King Nebuchadnezzar, Darius. There's several different Dariuses, and we're not sure which one threw Daniel in the lion's den. It's kind of a mystery to figure out which one of these Dariuses is referred to in the Bible. And there's a good chance that he might have gone by a different name in what we think of him in regular secular history. Because none of them seem to match up. None of the Dariuses we know of from secular history seem to match the time period that we're talking about there. But that's a whole other problem. But nonetheless, there are several. Now, the Persians, King Darius I, crushed the Ionian revolt and burned the Greek polis of Miletus right here, which will be reborn, and that's where Paul meets with the people from Ephesus when he's going back to Rome, or back to Jerusalem, and preparing to eventually head to Rome. And that's where he preaches all night, and there's a young man who falls out the window, and then he raises him from the dead when he dies from the fall. Please just cut your meetings off, at a reasonable hour, because you might not be able to raise someone from the dead who falls out the window because they're so tired from you talking all night. But Paul was able to do that. So they will move from here across and come into Greece. Now, Marathon is a location right here. I'll come back here in a minute. Here we go. Yeah. The Persian Wars, this is a picture of the Marathon Pass. But Marathon campaign, it was an overwhelming Athenian victory. They were not expected to win. One Athenian was able to escape and run back to Athens to inform them, a 27.2 mile run, the same amount of distance that a modern marathon is running. And he got all the way back to Athens, and before he collapsed of exhaustion, he shouted, "Nike," which in Greek is, "We did it." Just do it.
Yeah.
Is a little bit of a misnomer, but they're trying to be creative there with their advertising. But he comes back and he lets them know that they won. That was a surprise. Then the Athenian naval power, Xerxes, later on, who is the husband of Esther, Xerxes will invade Greece on foot, and he sacks Athens in the north. Then 300 Spartans will defend the pass of Thermopylae and prevent the Persians from getting south into the lower sections of Greece. Now, what is surprising about this was the greatest army in the world. But these 300 Spartans were able to defend the rest of Greece primarily because the valley was so narrow that the 300 men could easily block their way. And if they could win the fights with everyone that it doesn't matter if you've got 20,000 men behind you, if you kill the ones in front and keep killing the ones in front, you're going to win, no matter how many men are behind you. If you can't get more than 200 men through the valley, these 300 men can always get victory. Now, eventually, they will be wiped out because the Persians will bribe some local goat herders to show them paths around and then attack them from behind and surround them. But the delay was enough for the Athenians to raise another army that will defend them. Not only did they lose their normal fighting force, but he even put into battle the Invincibles, which were his private army that really weren't designed for fighting. You were just supposed to show them, and then everyone would go, "Oh no, the Invincibles are here," and then they would run away. Where the Spartans didn't care. And so the immortals were just slaughtered. And that really caused Xerxes to become dismayed. Now, on several occasions during this campaign, he did some very weird things. On one occasion, he tried to build a bridge across the river, and before the bridge could be used, a flood came and washed it away. Now, he was a little irrational, and so, of course, the engineers, guess what happened to them? Did they go back to school, or do you think they got...
They drowned.
They drowned or some, and then he instructed his army to whip the river 300 lashes. Bad river. You aren't, because the engineers were wrong for building a bridge that could so easily be washed away. But the river should not have tried to knock down the bridge in the first place. You can see why he might not have been the kind of person you would want to go to unannounced if you were his wife. He's known for doing things that are a little irrational, but he has got all power. And a person like that, you don't cross. You're working for him, you figure out how to survive another day. So if he says, kill that person, you do, and then you figure out how not to be the person in that shoe tomorrow. So you just try and live another day. That's your goal if you're working in a situation like that. You just pretend the person, you just kind of survive. They then will try and attack by boat, by coming in to this area. Now, if we look back here, they will come across and attack by ship. The Athenian navy defeated the Persians in the narrow straits of Salamis, right in here, right there. That was a significant victory for them. The Athenian ships were smaller, more maneuverable, and they had a special weapon called Greek fire, which looks like it was some sort of Molotov cocktail that when you threw it into the other wooden boat, when it would break, like the glass jar you put it in, it would then ignite in fire. And if it was sticky, maybe made of tar of some kind, it would stick to the wood and burn. And maybe the people too who happened to be in the wrong place. But that was a significant weapon to attack wooden ships with. So they were able to be victorious.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to do some legitimate comp civ for those of you into that kind of thing. Sam, I can't help but feel that we have perhaps too many globes. That's better. Today we're going to learn about the horrible totalitarian Persians and the saintly democracy-loving Greeks. But of course, we already know this story. There were some wars in which no one wore any shirts and everyone was reasonably fit. The Persians were bad. The Greeks were good. Socrates and Plato are awesome. The Persians didn't even philosophize. The West is the best. Go team! Yeah, well, no. Let's start with the Persian Empire, which became the model for pretty much all land-based empires throughout the world, except for, wait for it, the Mongols. Much of what we know about the Persians and their empire comes from an outsider writing about them, which is something we now call history. And one of the first true historians was Herodotus, whose famous book, The Persian Wars, talks about the Persians quite a bit. Now, the fact that Herodotus was Greek is important because it introduces us to the idea of historical bias, but more on that in a second. So the Persian Achaemenid dynasty, Achaemenid? Hold on. Achaemenid or Achaemenid? They're both right? I was right twice? Right, so the Persian Achaemenid or Achaemenid dynasty was founded in 539 BCE by King Cyrus the Great. Cyrus took his nomadic warriors and conquered most of Mesopotamia, including the Babylonians, which ended a sad period in Jewish history called the Babylonian exile, thus ensuring that Cyrus got great press in the Bible. But his son Darius I was even greater. He extended Persian control east to our old friend the Indus Valley, west to our new friend Egypt, and north to Crash Course newcomer Anatolia. By the way, there were Greeks in Anatolia called Ionian Greeks who will become relevant shortly. So even if you weren't Persian, the Persian Empire was pretty dreamy. For one thing, the Persians ruled with a light touch, like conquered kingdoms were allowed to keep their kings and their elites as long as they pledged allegiance to the Persian king and paid taxes, which is why the Persian king was known as the King of Kings. Plus, taxes weren't too high, and the Persians improved infrastructure with better roads, and they had this Pony Express-like mail service of which Herodotus said, "They are stayed neither by snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness, from accomplishing their appointed course with all speed." And the Persians embraced freedom of religion, like they were Zoroastrian, which hasn't claimed to be the world's first monotheistic religion. It was really Zoroastrianism that introduced us to the good-evil dualism we all know so well, you know, God and Satan, or Harry and Voldemort. But the Persians weren't very concerned about converting people of the empire to their faith. Plus, Zoroastrianism forbids slavery, and so slavery was almost unheard of in the Persian Empire. All in all, if you had to live in the 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire was probably the best place to do it, unless, that is, you believe Herodotus and the Greeks. We all know about the Greeks: architecture, philosophy, literature. The very word music comes from Greek, as does so much else in contemporary culture. Greek poets and mathematicians and architects and philosophers founded a culture that we still identify with, and they introduced us to many ideas, from democracy to fart jokes. And the Greeks gave the West our first dedicated history. They gave us our vocabulary for talking about politics. Plus, they gifted us our idealization of democracy, which comes from the government they had in Athens. Mr. Green, Mr. Green, Mr. Green, Mr. Green, did you say fart jokes? Oh, you don't ask about Doric, Ionian, or Corinthian columns. You don't ask about Plato's allegory of the cave. It's all scatological humor with you. It's time for the open letter? Really? Already? All right. An open letter. Stan. To Aristophanes. Dear Aristophanes. Oh, right, I have to check the secret compartment. Stan, what? Oh. Thank you, Stan. It's fake dog poo. How thoughtful. So good news and bad news, Aristophanes. 2,300 years after your death, this is the good news. You're still reasonably famous. Only 11 of your 40 plays survived. But even so, you're called the father of comedy. There are scholars devoted to your work. Now the bad news. Even though your plays are exceptionally well translated and absolutely hilarious, students don't like to read them in schools. They're always like, why do we gotta read this boring crap? And this must be particularly galling to you because so much of what you did in your career was make fun of boring crap, specifically in the form of theatrical tragedies. Plus, you frequently used actual crap to make jokes, such as when you had the chorus in the Acharnians imagining a character in your play throwing crap at a real poet you didn't like. You, Aristophanes, who wrote that under every stone works a politician, who called wealth the most excellent of all the gods. You, who are responsible for the following conversation. I want all to have a share of everything and everything to be in common. There will no longer be rich or poor. I shall begin by making land, money, everything that is private property common to all. But who will till the soil? The slaves. And yet you're seen as homework, drudgery. That, my friend, is a true tragedy. On the upside, we did take care of slavery. It only took us 2,000 years. Best wishes, John Green. When we think about the high point of Greek culture, exemplified by the Parthenon and the plays of Aeschylus, what we're really thinking about is Athens in the 4th century BCE, right after the Persian Wars. But Greece was way more than Athens. Greeks lived in city-states, which consisted of a city and its surrounding area. Most of these city-states featured at least some form of slavery, and in all of them, citizenship was limited to males. Sorry, ladies. Also, each of these city-states had its own form of government, ranging from very democratic, unless you were a woman or a slave, to completely dictatorial. And the people who lived in these cities considered themselves citizens of that city, not of anything that would ever be called Greece, at least until the Persian Wars. So between 490 and 480 BCE, the Persians made war on the Greek city-states. This was the war that featured the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 brave Spartans battled, if you believe Herodotus, 5 million Persians, and also the Battle of Marathon, which is a plain about 26.2 miles away from Athens. The whole war started because Athens supported those aforementioned Ionian Greeks when they were rebelling in Anatolia against the Persians. That made the Persian king Xerxes mad, so he led 2 major campaigns against the Athenians, and the Athenians enlisted the help of all the other Greek city-states. In the wake of that shared Greek victory, the Greeks began to see themselves as Greeks rather than as Spartans or Athenians or whatever. And then Athens emerged as the de facto capital of Greece and then got to experience a golden age, which is something that historians make up. But a lot of things did happen during the golden age, including the Parthenon, a temple that became a church and then a mosque and then an armory until finally settling into its current gig as a ruin. You also had statesmen like Pericles, whose famous funeral oration brags about the golden democracy of Athens with rhetoric that wouldn't sound out of place today. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. And when you combine that high-minded rhetoric with the undeniable power and beauty of the art and philosophy that was created in ancient Athens, it's not hard to see it as the foundation of Western civilization. And if you buy into this, you have to be glad that the Greeks won the Persian Wars. But even if you put aside the slavery and other injustices in Greek society, there's still trouble. Do I have to say it? Seriously? Fine. Trouble, right here in River City with a capital T, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for Peloponnese. Pericles' funeral oration comes from a later war, the Peloponnesian War, which was a 30-year conflict between the Athenians and the Spartans. The Spartans did not embrace democracy, but instead embraced a kingship that functioned only because of a huge class of brutally mistreated slaves. But to be clear, the war was not about Athens trying to get Sparta to embrace democratic reform. Wars rarely are. It was about resources and power, and the Athenians were hardly saintly in all of this, as evidenced by the famous Melian dialogue. Let's go to the plot. So in one of the most famous passages of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians sailed to the island of Melos, a Spartan colony, and demanded that the Melians submit to Athenian rule. The Melians pointed out that they never actually fought with the Spartans and were like, listen, if it's all the same to you, we'd like to go Switzerland on this one, except of course they didn't say that because there was no Switzerland, to which the Athenians responded, and here I am quoting directly, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Needless to say, this is not a terribly democratic or enlightened position to take. This statement, in fact, is sometimes seen as the first explicit endorsement of the so-called theory of realism in international relations. For realists, interaction between nations or peoples or cultures is all about who has the power. Whoever has it can compel whoever doesn't have it to do pretty much anything. So what did the meritocratic and democratic Athenians do when the Melians politely asked not to participate in the fight? They killed all the Melian men and enslaved all the women and children. So yes, Socrates gave us his interrogative method, Sophocles gave us Oedipus, but the legacy of ancient Greece is profoundly ambiguous. All the more so because the final winner of the Peloponnesian War were the dictatorial Spartans. Thanks for the incredible bummer, Thought Bubble. So here's a non-rhetorical question. Did the right side win the Persian Wars? Most classicists and defenders of the Western tradition will tell you that of course we should be glad the Greeks won. After all, winning the Persian Wars set off the cultural flourishing that gave us the classical age. And plus, if the Persians had won with their monarchy, they might have strangled democracy in its crib and gave us more one-man rule. And that's possible, but as a counter to that argument, let's consider three things. First, it's worth remembering that life under the Persians was pretty good. And if you look at the last 5,000 years of human history, you'll find a lot more successful and stable empires than you will democracies. Second, life under the Athenians wasn't so awesome, particularly if you were a woman or a slave, and their government was notoriously corrupt. And ultimately, the Athenian government derived its power not from its citizens, but from the imperialist belief that might makes right. It's true that Athens gave us Socrates, but let me remind you, they also killed him. Well, I mean, they forced him to commit suicide. Whatever, Herodotus, you're not the only one here who can engage in historical bias. And lastly, under Persian rule, the Greeks might have avoided the Peloponnesian War, which ended up weakening the Greek city-states so much that Alexander, coming soon, the Great's father, was able to conquer all of them. And then there were a bunch of bloody wars with the Persians and all kinds of horrible things. And Greece wouldn't glimpse democracy again for 2 millennia, all of which might have been avoided if they had just let themselves get beaten by the Persians. All of which forces us to return to the core question of human history. What's the point of being alive? I've got this for a guy. I don't have to worry about it. Should we try to ensure the longest?
Okay, next time we'll be together for our test and we'll take that.
Hopefully.
Just normal. 24/7. So David, I said, masks are the best thing since smiles. Read the list I got? I want to come to the library and I'll be down there.